How's everyone doing? What I want to do in this particular lecture is just start to expose students to the ideas that are so prominent within ethics. And anytime you start thinking about a particular discipline or subdiscipline, you're going to talk about different theoretical perspectives. And from an ethical point of view, we're going to talk about two major paradigms, teleologies and deontologies, and the theories that kind of compose those. Before we start getting into that, though, here's just a nice little quote from Malloy in 2003. I just want you to I'm going to take a few seconds and let you read this. The big question for us is that, why do you have to take a sports ethics course? Yeah, it's required, obviously, but why is it required? When it seems like many other, as they say in the quote, sectors, business, health, law, have looked at the ethical dilemmas, the moral implications, and how ethics in general relates to that particular institution. And that kind of sets the stage for what we want to do, because it's very easy to sit back and sit around in a circle and everyone talk about their opinion about what they believe to be moral or immoral and that kind of thing. But that's not really ethics. Ethics has a lot to do with more of an explicit, clearly articulated framework. So again, a brief review from the previous lecture. Ethics is going to examine this idea of not necessarily just right and wrong, okay, but expectations and adherence to rules and behavior, what you should do in certain situations. And then if you conform to that or you do not conform, obviously, then we can look at those particular things. And so we're bringing in the notions, the ideas of something larger than just the individual. The individual is going to process ethical dilemmas, and eventually decision-making processes are going to happen on an individualistic basis. But ethics for us is that large exogenous framework, that thing outside of us that influences us. And what we'd like to do is study that process. Okay, if you look at what a value is, it's something that's desirable, correct, and good. Well, it's something obviously valuable, and you want to strive for it. It's what you should be doing in this situation. Well, values originate from a variety of different places, and depending on where you're from, your worldview, your background, all that kind of stuff, your values are going to be somewhat different. Now, that's not to say there's not large homogeneous value systems out there. Some of the things that we value in sport here in America and around the world is just the idea of competition, honest competition. So those are values. Well, if we just start with this basic monolithic idea of a value, it can get very confusing at times, because what we find is there are a couple different types of values: the instrumental and the terminal. The terminal is what it sounds like. It's the end in and of itself. The instrumental value is something that's going to be used. Kind of think of it as kind of like an equation. A plus B equals C. Well, A and B are your instrumental values. All right, they're going to be used in this situation in conjunction with each other. The terminal value, that thing at the end that you're going for, that C, if we're sticking with that little basic equation, that's the terminal value. So we have the example, if we're talking about sport, how does sport play in this process, and how does it act and interact with values? Well, if you look at, especially here in this capitalistic system that we operate under here in the United States, teamwork is going to be very important, working in groups, cooperation, that type of thing. Well, teamwork is something that's going to be valued in sport. All right? Well, why? Well, it's going to help develop those interaction skills. If you learn how to cooperate with other kids, and then this learning of specific skills is going to be useful to whatever career that individual has. So sport is part of that process. All right? Well, those two things together, combined, can lead to that last value. And if you think about American culture, and we're striving for a sense of happiness, right, sport can be part of that process. Well, sport in this particular example is not necessarily going to be a terminal value, but it's it provides the opportunity for one of those instrumental values to be learned, that of teamwork. Okay, so we're talking about values, and when you're looking at conformity, the fact that everyone believes in a certain value, consensus, okay, we still want to examine that process. There are two major ways to do that: teleologies and deontologies. Now, Try not to get bogged down into the jargon and the nomenclature of ethics. Okay. Historically, in the past, students have had more trouble, not necessarily with the ideas, but more trouble actually saying the words than anything else. And so, teleologies, it's looking at morality. It's looking at understanding the duty or the moral obligation that the individual has to achieving whatever is considered desirable. The most important thing about a teleological point of view is that terminal value, the end result. So that's why oftentimes we think about ends-oriented ethical inquiry. You're going to look at and examine the process, yes, and you're going to look at what benefits the most people. But the way that you understand that benefit to most people is by looking at the end result. Okay, example here. We know that high school sports, they're expensive. And oftentimes, in this constrained economic climate, we have to make cuts in the public school system especially. If you look at the City League here, or in the Wichita metro area, the City League schools in junior high do not play football. They can't afford it. Okay, and so when it comes to cutting particular programs and trying to trim the fat in education, what do? Do you cut sports? Do you cut the arts, music, other extracurricular activity classes like that? There's a lot going on that goes into that decision. The pay-for-play model, which has become popular, especially on the East Coast in certain sports like football. The idea is that the schools can't necessarily support an athletic program of football. But if you have the money, you're willing to buy your spikes or your cleats, you're willing to buy your shoulder pads, and you're willing to travel to the games, then the school will have a football team. If you're not, then they're not going to have one. Right? So when you're sitting down and you're like, okay, look at the college environment. We know that collegiate football teams cost a lot of money. Now, the teleological point of view, does that cost for that particular football program, are we willing to absorb that cost because the rewards that it provides to the campus community or the municipal community in which it's embedded or the region is far greater and far outweighs those upfront financial costs? That's what we're talking about. That's what a teleological ethical point of view is going to examine, that end result. Does that end result benefit the most number of people possible? Now, specific theories that relate to that, there's a few of them. One is egoism, which is one of the kind of the first and most basic ways of understanding teleologies and ethics. The idea that you're going to fulfill whatever makes you happy. All right. You're not going to deny your own interests. You're not going to purposely put barriers in front of you. We're not saying this when you say egoism. It doesn't mean you're selfish. If we say you're egocentric, okay, it just means that primarily everything is the way that you understand the world starts and more or less ends with you. Well, this is very, very common when you're talking about free agency, for example, in professional sport, or owners, and oftentimes you talk about holding a community hostage because they want a new facility and that kind of thing. Even down to something as simple as charging tickets, admission, prices, that kind of thing. Many years ago, the Cincinnati Bengals in the NFL, they had years of mediocrity. That's probably being nice. They were bad. They were a bad football team. So they go 8-8. It's not technically a winning season, but the very next year they raised ticket prices, and people were willing to pay it. And that's a conversation that the organization, the franchise, is going to have internally. Is it worth it? It's not necessarily bad, but you're focusing not necessarily on the constituents in that particular instance, but you're focusing more on your organization. Utilitarianism, it's kind of interesting. Jeremy Bentham, what he tried to do is he tried to, when we talk about qualifying pleasure, happiness, he developed a hierarchy. Because the whole idea of utilitarianism is that the only good that's worth pursuing out there is this notion of pleasure or happiness. All right. Well, Bentham's like, hey, that's a pretty good idea, except I think we need to put some parameters on what constitutes happiness. There's different layers and different levels of it. What makes you happy and what makes your constituents or program consumers happy, that's going to be a slightly different thing. Okay, utilitarianism. You can't talk about the notion of utility and utilitarianism without talking about John Stuart Mill. And he's kind of taking what Bentham started and expanding it. All right, that hierarchy that's out there. Well, you need to make sure that everyone in your organization knows that the greatest number of people are benefiting. All right, and if they're benefiting, most likely there's some sort of aspect of happiness out there, and that's a result of whatever it is that you, your organization, your sport program, whatever it is that you're involved with, your services, that's what you're providing. All right, so if you say I want to make sure that my employees are happy in a recreation environment, they're going to work 9 to 5 because that's what makes them happy. Well, what makes your constituents or the community happy is having a rec facility or center that's open before and after excuse me, those ideas or that time frame of 9 to 5. All right, the pleasure, the happiness derived from the community being happy is actually something that's going to be higher on that hierarchical structure as compared to the individualistic happiness. Okay, and so as you're trying to arrange these pleasures or this idea of happiness in order, well, the notion of pursuing the higher pleasures such as knowledge and benefit to others, those types of things, that's what's going to be at the top of the ladder. The individual maximization of pleasure and all that type of thing, that's going to be at the bottom. Okay, and a great example is Title IX. We're not advocating one point of view or the other. Using this particular framework, okay, Title IX, as it currently stands, is actually benefiting more people. Yes, you've heard the arguments, and this is primarily, this is not written into Title IX in terms of being compliance. A lot of people say, well, you know, you have to, the notion was that you're going to add more opportunities for girls and women to participate in sport. Well, a lot of people have kind of taken the cost-benefit analysis aspect, and what they've done is they've looked at, okay, we have X number of males, X number of females, and we want to make that closer, so we're going to get rid of some of male sports. All right, that's kind of going against the whole idea of Title IX. That's more of a compliance issue more so than the spirit of Title IX. The spirit of Title IX is based upon this idea of, you know, a greater sense of utility and a greater sense of enjoying sport for everyone, even if we have to mandate it, and that's what Title IX is, allowing a greater opportunity for girls and women in sport. Teleologies can get very complicated. Basically what I'm trying to do here is just graphically show that you have the larger kind of paradigmatic view, and that's what teleologies are. Teleologies, then a couple of specific theories that are classified as teleologies would be utilitarianism and egoism. And there's just a hypothetical example. This didn't happen, but if you're talking about, you know, the United States reputation in basketball, especially international basketball, okay, patriotism, that's one of the things, one of those values that we want to look at, examine. Well, maybe it's declined because of mediocre performances in the recent past of the U.S. men's international basketball team. So let's say, hypothetically, of course, Carmelo Anthony is on the team, all right, and he does something to one particular opposing player. Maybe it's a foul, all right. The foul goes against the rules of the game, all right. That foul, however, helped to change the momentum, if you believe in that. Let's say he takes a hard foul as a, you know, Spanish team member who's going up for a dunk or something like that. You know, you don't want to give up the easy points, send him to the free throw line. All right, within the game, that's considered bad, but in terms of the context of the entire game, in terms of a strategy, and hopefully at the end of it, this idea that you have a win and an increase in patriotism, well, maybe that foul was actually kind of good. So teleologies is not quite as cut and dry in terms of understanding this end result and how you get there. It's not focusing on the process, it's focusing on the end result. Deontologies, however, are focusing on that process, or what we call the intrinsic qualities of what's going on in the situation. Okay, if you focus on the relationship, this logical, commonsensical idea that if you're doing good things all the time, then the end result is obviously going to be good. And in the sense of what we're trying to do here, much like with teleologies, it's a notion of duty, obligation. What we're trying to do is maximize the benefit for all of humankind. You're not doing things because it provides an outcome that you enjoy. You're doing it because it's the right thing to be doing. You know, I give the little example, if you kind of think back to, I mean, we do this on all levels of sport, but I always kind of think of the youth sport days, you know, summer baseball and all that kind of stuff. You had the handshake line afterwards, right? Well, why are you doing that? You're going through that process, and admittedly sometimes you're a little alienated, not thinking about it, but if you're into it and invested in the process, you're congratulating your opponent, saying, you know what, you played a good game. Whether you lost or won, it doesn't necessarily matter. You're respecting that individual's effort. You're not doing it because you want to be seen as a great person or you want the coach or the opposing players to like you. You do it because that's the right thing. You respect their effort. You respect the way they played the game. If you think back a few years ago, the Duke lacrosse sexual assault case and that scandal there, you know, there's a lot going on. You know, it's a very, very complicated situation that we'll talk about later in the semester, but they canceled the season. The Duke men's lacrosse team was number 2 preseason in the polls, and they canceled the entire season. And it's a very, of course, we have the benefit of hindsight, and hindsight is obviously 20/20. And what we found is a lot of the allegations didn't necessarily stick, and so in hindsight, it looks like they canceled the season for nothing. But at the time, imagine being the chancellor or the president or athletic director or something like that, and you get a call early in the morning that says, hey, you had this horrendous event and the allegations of this gross misconduct. What do you do? Well, and what they were saying is that the sport of lacrosse, that's not as important as the overall welfare of getting things straight, figuring out what happened. Now, you could argue that that's a deontological point of view. Now, if you really like teleologies, you could argue from a teleological point of view that maybe they should have kept it or not or whatever. And maybe the more cynical person says, well, you know, they were just worried about the racial and gender implications, so they wanted to make sure that, you know, they canceled this season so that this would look good. That's, you know, that's fair. We have to think about all these different arguments, but nonetheless, deontologies just provide us another way of looking at it. Well, maybe deontologies in terms of being as a paradigm, you want a little bit more specificity. The golden rule, the whole idea to treat others how you would like to be treated, that's a great example because it's about the process. You're not doing it because you necessarily want everyone to like you. It's that altruistic actions, the fact that you're going to do something that's, you know, unselfish. You're going to be nice because that's what you would like in return. That's a great example of a deontological point of view because you're focusing on the process. Everything's going to take care of itself down the line. Immanuel Kant, Kantian ethics. Basically, he was talking about moral behavior and how it should benefit most of humanity. Okay, well, there's a lot of different things that we can get into with Kant. He was very, very influential, primarily. What I'm kind of interested in is you understand these categorical imperatives such as honesty and things like that. Basically saying that your duty to fellow humans is to be and follow these categorical imperatives regardless of what the consequences in any situation are going to be. You're not supposed to lie. So if you're sitting in front of a congressional sub-hearing and you're talking about steroids in baseball, whether your reputation is on the line or not, you should not be lying. Kind of think of Rafael Palmeiro shaking his finger at Congress there. That violated categorical imperatives. Now, what's also very interesting when I like to talk about the categorical imperatives is that they're based on 2 moral principles. 1, everyone should be treated with respect, regardless of any demographic factor. All right? And these moral judgments are equally binding. They're applied to everyone at all times, and that kind of goes in with this idea of respect. If you're a human, and you can make the argument if you want to get into animal sports and things like that, that it sort of transcends whether you're human or not. But there's a sense of right and wrong, of duty, things that you're supposed to be doing. You know, Mark McGuire famously said, I'm not here to talk about the past, I'm here to talk about the present and the future. And that's fine. And that's fine. You know, but standing up in players that test positive, Ryan Braun in Major League Baseball, the MVP that kind of comes to mind and all that. To stand up in front of people, if it's found out that you're lying, Floyd Landis, that kind of thing, obviously a gross violation of these categorical imperatives from a Kantian point of view. Kant's interesting because it gets very complicated. The thing that's nice is that we can look to business ethics as a way for translating Kantian influence into the sport management industry, because the idea of fairness, equality, if you're fair at all times in every situation, then that's going to insulate you from any wrongdoing. Now that sounds easy and well and good, and it's obviously more nuanced and very difficult to do that, but one of the things within the world of sport, if you're talking about decision-making processes and things like that, it's the idea of being transparent. When you went through the hiring process at Penn State to find a new coach to replace Joe Paterno, there were a lot of people that when Coach O'Brien was hired, they didn't necessarily disagree with the hire, they disagreed with the process to hire this individual. They said it was shrouded in secrecy and mystery, and even people on the interviewing committee didn't know who this person was and found out through the media like everyone else that this person had been hired, and so there wasn't transparency there. You know, that's a really good example of, again, a violation of a Kantian path and a Kantian deontological point of view, because the idea is that everyone should be involved. Every decision should be fair, should be equal, and should be handled in such a way that it's going to benefit as many people as possible. And if you're doing things fairly, then that end result by its very nature is going to be fair. Again, another graphical representation of everything. It's a little bit more complicated with the deontologies that we're talking about here, but overall, again, the idea that a couple basic things: a Kantian view, and then the golden rule. Golden rule being very, very simple. You know, kind of focusing on altruism and how you would like to be treated, and then a Kantian point of view, which is the categorical imperatives, telling the truth, and how these things are going to be morally binding to everyone at all times. Again, those hallmarks, those values, if you want to go back to that earlier discussion, of equality and respect. Just want to briefly touch on metaethics. It's kind of loosely associated with the deontological point of view, and they kind of argue what is considered right, what is considered good. And theories of justice, if you talk about egalitarianism and libertarianism, these things are kind of interesting. They're unique little ways of looking at and understanding certain ethical dilemmas within the world of sport. Egalitarianism just kind of sounds like it's talking about justice and equality, whereas libertarianism, liberty, you know, the procedures, fair rules, you know, that whole idea of the autonomy to think about the process. All right, and again, that's why metaethics is loosely associated with deontologies, because of the process. You know, if you're focusing on equality and being just, right, and good at every step within the hiring process, then that hire that you make at the end, you know that you're going to be very, very confident, and they're going to add a lot to your sport organization. And you can think about this in terms of salary caps. You know, the NFL is more of a hard cap, and Major League Baseball is a soft cap with the luxury tax and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of this actually comes into play when you get into management and labor discussions. You know, we had the NBA and the NFL lockouts recently, and kind of looking at this whole notion of the collective bargaining agreements and the things that they come to and player representation. Are these fair rules? Is everything actually going to be equal and just for both the owners and the players? That type of thing. Oftentimes, and you've probably picked up on this, and we sort of made mention of this earlier in previous discussions, is that ethics, it's interesting because your worldview, where you come from, and the things that have happened to your life, they greatly influence how you view the world, the values that you hold near and dear, and how you see and process things. Well, ethical relativism is just an idea that we need to be open to a variety of ideas. You know, we talk about diversity, and we generally think of diversity as gender, race, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, disability, that kind of thing. Oop, guess I need to plug in my laptop, huh? But it's also your point of view. the things that you hold near and dear. If you think about religious ideologies and how people subscribe to certain things within the world of sport, occasionally you'll get examples of maybe, for example, Muslim players that because of their beliefs can't do certain rituals, pre-game rituals, that kind of thing. All right. To judge people as being right and wrong because they're holding near and dear to some sort of principle is not necessarily something that we would like to do within sport. We're trying to get past that. So ethical relativism is just, it comes out of this idea of almost like cultural relativism, where you just accept that there are other ideas out there, and that's okay, and that acceptance and that understanding of diversity, that's what's going to be most important for us. Think about it, if you come from a different culture and now you're involving sport. Well, you have to examine that culture and understand the belief system and make sure that whatever's being promoted within your sport or within your services or whatever jives with what's going on around you. And realize that you have different points of view, and that if everyone has different points of view, if you can open the dialogue and the discussion, then just the mere fact that you've opened that dialogue and discussion, that's a great example of being open and diverse regarding ethical and moral points of view. Okay, so just want you to take a second to think about these things. If you're looking at, and try to give a couple of different things that are prominent within the world of sport: sportsmanship, competition, intimidation, and think about how these different points of view, teleologies, deontologies, how they would examine this issue, especially if you're thinking about trying to develop protocol or bylaws within an organizational environment. Do you mandate sportsmanship? And how do you do that? Maybe it's that handshake line. Do you mandate it? Yes, because we want to make sure that everyone, even in the heat of the moment after a contest, that if we force them to respect their other opponents, then eventually at some point it's going to click. There's a variety of different ways of doing these things and looking at it. There's no right or wrong answer. Another thing to kind of think about is when you mandate or you think about where the influence peddlers within the world of sport come from, what's more important, money or morality? Now, the Smith & Street SportBusiness Journal did an article in 2007. It's very enlightening because it was looking at fans, kind of a consumption-based point of view. Does the consumer really care about the morality of the athletes, or do they care more about the performance of the athlete? Well, that's an age-old question. Do fans care about PEDs in sport, or do investigative journalists simply care about PEDs in sports? It's very, very difficult, anytime you're talking about tens of millions of people perhaps that consume, or even hundreds of millions of people that consume soccer around the globe, or the Olympic movement. If you talk about football here in the United States, it's hard to say because we're talking about different levels. But nonetheless, what teleologies and deontologies allow us to do is the opportunity to examine some of these potential arenas within the world of sport.